let's get started with our Bible study today. We are in the book of Judges, of course. Judges chapter 8. Verses 1 through 7 we're going to start with. But just as the reminder, the historical voice, the moral voice, and then that gospel witness. And we, of course, are focused on the gospel witness. But if you'll look at verses 1 through 7, it says, "Then the men of Ephraim said to him, what is this that you've done to us, not to call us when you went to fight against Midian?" And they accused him fiercely. So they're feeling a little slighted that they were left out of the battle. Remember, now God whittled his army down, right? Mm-hmm. So it really wasn't Gideon's fault, the way that God wanted to use Gideon to fight Midian. But Ephraim is feeling a little bit slighted, and because Gideon was of the tribe of Manasseh, all right? So Manasseh was used by God to deliver Israel instead of Ephraim, which is where Deborah, the former judge, was of the tribe of Ephraim. And so they were kind of, in some ways, getting that big head. Well, we're the tribe that God uses for that stuff, not your tribe. Plus, also, if you remember all the way back to Genesis, when Joseph blessed Ephraim instead of Manasseh, so Ephraim got the blessing, and they were God's special tribe, right, in their eyes. And so I think there's a little of that going on. Why didn't you call us? And I think one of the principles is that people who've gone before us, oftentimes will feel superior or entitled. Like we're the ones that, we've been. I mean, you've heard people. We've been in this church, when you were in diapers, And
we've always done it this way.
Yeah, and then the younger generation does something new and different, and they're like, "Well, you didn't ask me," Things like that will always happen, and we'll see it later on in this section that we're studying, that it goes forward as well. The next generation makes the same mistake as the older generation. They assume, I can pick on those who are older than me, but I do the same thing to those who are younger than me. I don't know how many conversations I've had with my kids about, now when I was your age, I do the exact same, and they roll their eyes just like I did at my parents, right? And so, but spiritually, we have to be cautious of that God will oftentimes do something new in a new generation. He'll do something new with and a lot of times just because they have a different perspective on things and they have different experiences. If you think back in the 50s, how did you minister to prostitutes back in the 50s?
How did you?
You told them to stop it. He said, repent, and get into church and put some clothes on, hussy. Right? And I mean, that's how you minister to prostitutes. Well, nowadays it's a little different, and there are actually quite a few that are coming to the Lord because of the way that you've heard stories of these ladies who actually go to like the strip bars and things like that, and they minister to these dancers, and teach them about the love of God, and their lives are being transformed and turned around. And that's that old adage that nobody sits there and says, when I grow up, I want to be a dancer in a nude bar. Mm-hmm. No one has that dream. And you find yourself there, right? And they feel trapped, and they need someone to come and deliver them just as much as the next person. But Gideon placates them in an interesting way. They're mad at him, and in verse 2, he said, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer?" So he doesn't even mention Manasseh, right? He only mentions his tribal name. And then he says, it's not the gleaning, aren't you better at harvesting than we are? Aren't you better at everything, basically? God has given into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. So it was Ephraim who went and after the battle, when he called everybody out, and then Ephraim came and went into battle, but they were mad because they weren't invited to the first fight, you know. And he's like, but didn't you do this? What have I been able to do in comparison with you? And so he strokes their ego.
Mm-hmm.
He strokes their spiritual egos too, you know. And it's just, then their anger against him subsided when he said this. And a lot of times when you come up against someone who is just mad about how you're doing things, just talk about how great they did what they did. And they'll be like, okay, as long as, you know. And I've discovered a lot of times when people are mad, especially in church situations, when they're just upset, they really don't necessarily need things to go their way. They just need you to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they just need you to hear their bit. And if you can truly listen and hear, sometimes you learn something. You're like, oh, I guess we could do it different. But a lot of times they just need you to hear them. They just need to know that you know that they matter. You know, and that's an important thing. Verse 4, Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, and he had 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. So these 300 guys that he's been fighting with since the day before, right? And they have not had a break, and they're chasing now. Ephraim has captured Oreb and Zeb, but they're still chasing these two guys named Zeba and Zalmunna, and they're just worn out. And the battle has been successful, but they're not done yet, right? So in verse 5, he said to the men of Succoth. Now Succoth is, it means like booth or protection, like a shelter. And the men of Succoth are asked by Gideon, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zeba and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. So they're after, Oreb and Zeb were like the military commanders, and now they're after Zeba and Zalmunna, who were the kings of Midian. And they're asking the men of Succoth to give them bread because they're worn out from their fighting and their pursuing. And there's like, we're about to go and get the head of the serpent, basically. We're almost done. We're almost there. We just need some provisions along the way. Well, of course, the response from the officials in Succoth said, are the hands of Zeba and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? And so the men of Succoth were more devoted to their own safety than they were helping Gideon's men arrive at victory. Because if they failed in capturing Zeba and Zalmunna, and word got out that they helped Gideon and his army, then revenge might come on them, right? Even though these are their own people, right? These are Hebrews. And so Gideon's response in verse 7, well then, when the Lord has given Zeba and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. I'm going to whip you silly. Okay? All the men in that town.
Just so they'll look like.
I'm going to whip you silly.
Yeah.
And it's just exactly how you think. He's going to go get briars, and he's going to tear their clothes off their back, and he's going to rip them to shreds, and teach them a lesson. And so keep that in mind. That's what Gideon has said is going to happen to Succoth, because they refused to nourish the armies. They didn't come to the support of those who were doing the work. Instead, they were just like, well, we'll see how it turns out. You know? And how many times have you seen that happen in church circles as well? Somebody's get a brand new vision for doing something, and then the folks were like, well, we'll just see what happens. And if it starts to work, we'll get on board. And if it doesn't, we'll say, well, we didn't think it was going to work in the beginning. Yeah. And they play it safe. And there's something about that when you, in one way, it denies the unity of the body. It denies that we're all in this together. And And there's truth to the fact that some people go off half-cocked and without wisdom, and they don't listen to their elders. But they were delivering Israel from the Midianites. There was nothing wrong about what they were doing. It was just fear that was motivating the men of Succoth. There was not wisdom. It was just fear. So we go into verses 8 through 12. From there, he went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. Now, Penuel means turn and see the face of God. This is what Jacob named the place where he wrestled with God face to face, Penuel. And so that means to turn and actually see God face to face. And that's important. And why is that important? They answered the same way as the men of Succoth had answered in verse 9. And he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. So the men of Penuel, the men of the city, the leaders, they were hiding in their stronghold, in their tower. And basically talking down to Gideon and his men saying, yeah, good luck. He's like, when I come back in victory, I'm going to take this thing out with you in it. It's not a good outcome for the men of Penuel, as you'll find out. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna, in verse 10, were in Karkor with their army. And that Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor. Don't these just sound like Star Wars names?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really.
What? So now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor. Now Zebah means sacrifice, and Zalmunna means no shade from the sun. Okay, that's what the name is, like, no shade from the sun. So and in scriptures, when you talk about sun and the heat of the sun and the relentless onslaught of the sun, it speaks of the anger of authority. It's like his anger burned like the noonday sun. It's just, and then so no shade from the sun is just this relentless. I'm never happy with you. And then the name Zebah, sacrifice, speaks of this idea that in order to serve our other gods that we choose, it is almost always, what are you going to give up to get this? What are you going to give up to get this? What are you going to give up to get this? And that's that constant negative connotation of sacrifice, because in our God, who paid the price? Who was the sacrifice? He was the sacrifice on our behalf. So even our God's totally different than every other God. He himself is the sacrifice for our sins. And where all of the other gods that we could ever serve are going to demand sacrifice from us. And you will not be able to please them. It will be constant sun and no shade. What is our God? He says, I will be your shadow of protection, he says. I will shelter you under the shadow of my wings. And we have a different God that we serve. And so Zebah and Zalmunna kind of represent that notion of, if you want to serve the other gods, you're going to regret it. It's just, you're going to be miserable. And so these enemies, they fight us, demanding sacrifice, relentless heat or anger. And oftentimes we have these negative views of God. We think, what do I have to do to make you happy? And what do I have to give you, to get something from you? And we approach God in the same way, because that's how we've been trained, how you approach, gods. But I think God, the testimony of Scripture, he's pretty clear. That's not how I operate. I don't operate that way at all. Will I demand your life? Yes, so that I can bless you, so that I can fix it for you, not so that I can consume you. And so he offers us his shadow. The psalmist clarifies that he does not delight in sacrifice, but it is a contrite spirit is what God's after. Our contrition, in other words, our repentance, is all that he's after. He's not after the blood of calves and sheep. He's after your heart. So they're in Karkor, all right? Karkor means even ground. And so I think that just means that, and it says that here in a little bit, they felt comfortable. The army felt secure down at the end of verse 11. But they're in Karkor with their army, and the army felt they had equal footing here. They stood a chance here. And, remember we talked about how the enemy will always retreat to that safe place where they feel like it's their stronghold, a place where they're comfortable, fighting in their own territory. And they felt like they stood a chance, and it was security for them. But they have only 15,000 men, which seems like a lot until you realize they had 120 when they first got started, just the day before. Okay, so they're down to I think that's like an eighth ish of what they had, and so they have been just decimated. And they're here, but finally have reached a place where they feel like they're on even ground. But it's east of Nobah and Jogbehah. What interesting names. Again, Star Wars names, Nobah and Jogbehah. And Nobah means to bark, like a dog. And
That's what I'd want to name my kid.
Nobah. And Jogbehah means lofty or exalted. And these are little villages. But Nobah and Jogbehah, to bark, lofty, and perhaps this is a comment on the Midianite army, even though they felt like they were on equal footing. When the Jewish audience would have read this phrase, they would have heard something along the lines of, "Oh, all bark and no bite." They were proud and lofty, and they had a loud bark, but they were destroyed there, east of Nobah and Jogbehah. So just think of that phrase: all bark and no bite. You've seen it, like a chihuahua, right? It's like,
They can bite.
Oh yeah, they can bite.
yeah,
Not very high.
No.
not very high, not very high. But I've never met a Chihuahua that didn't think he was a Doberman.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like,
Yeah.
and then you meet some of these giant dogs that could just eat your face off, and they're just giant lap dogs. Like, play. But anyway,
I want to lick you.
yeah. Excuse me. So they attacked the army there, and the army felt secure. Verse 12, and Zebah and Zalmunna fled. And he, Gideon, pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he threw all the army into a panic. So again, when the head is taken, the rest of the army falls apart. So what's left of those 15,000 men, however many survived this battle, are in disarray. They're all running their separate ways. Okay? Questions, comments before we move on? All right. So verse 13. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres. And that's like a mountain pass, Mount Heres. But Heres means sun. But the word Heres means a little bit more than just, a lot of translators just translate it as sun. But what it really means is extended time in the sun. And it's this connotation of, but it's also the same word that is used to describe people who are suntanned. And so you wouldn't just say Heres to refer to the sun. If you said, you would look at someone and say, Heres, they've got a suntan. They're darker now because they've been out in the sun. It's just like if somebody goes on vacation to Florida and they come back and they're like, oh, you got some sun. That's the idea when the Hebrews would use that phrase Heres. And so here's Gideon coming back, and he may have physically looked like he had been out in the sun all day. I don't know, but I think of this idea of when Moses had gone to spend time with God, he came back and they knew it.
Mhm.
You know, when the disciples were preaching, and the others are like, these are like people who have been with God, the way they're talking. You know, and it's that you begin to become a different kind of person when you walk with God, when you do the things that God has asked you to do. You walk at a different stature, right? Do you remember at the beginning of the story, Gideon is hiding in the wine press threshing his wheat, and now he's making threats to the men of Penuel. And the men of Succoth, I'm going to whip you silly, and I'm going to tear down your tower. He is a different guy, right? And so by the time he comes back, he has not only conquered the Midianites and wiped out, so they had so many men to start with, you couldn't even count them, whittles them down to 15,000. And then this final battle, who knows how many survived that, but he gets the two generals, and he gets the two kings of Midian. And it's just this idea that at this point he's like, I can pretty much do anything. He has so much confidence. You know, thankfully, I think at this point it's still in the Lord. You know, it's not in himself, but he is not afraid of anything. And he captured a young man from Succoth, verse 14, and he questioned him. And he wrote down for him the officials and the elders of Succoth, 77 men. So he gets this list of 77 guys from this town. And he knows these are the guys that made the decision not to help us. Right? And it doesn't, you know, there's no question of, were there any dissenters? Were there any who said maybe we should help them? He's like, no, they're all one. You know, he treats them that way. And he comes to the men of Succoth and he said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. All right? So what happens to the men of Succoth? They get whipped silly, right? And we think, well, that's a little extreme, Gideon. It was over some bread. Well, it wasn't just over bread.
Mhm.
You know, they were in the middle of a firefight, and they felt abandoned by their own people. And what happens to the men of Succoth is they get whipped, and they learn their lesson. Next time Gideon comes, guess what they're going to do? They're going to take care of him and his men.
Right.
Verse 17, though, is a little different. He broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. These men die. Now, what do you think is the difference between the men of Penuel and the men of Succoth, who both essentially did the same thing? Why is there a difference in their punishment?
Because what in the Lord and one didn't.
I think you're on the right track. You're very much on the right track. It's similar to that. I think they both believed in the Lord, but I think it has to do with their closeness to the Lord. And why do I believe that? A couple reasons. And because when you see that, you're like, well, why is there a difference here? Why did one town get spared, seemingly, with just a whipping, and the next town, all the men are put to death? But Gideon comes back a changed man. He whips the men of Succoth for their lack of concern, but the men of Penuel are treated more harshly, and they're put to death. Their tower is torn down. And why the difference? Possibly, you could make the assumption that the men of Penuel were emboldened by the men of Succoth, and they were copycats, and Gideon just didn't like that. But I don't think that it's that simple. It would be that they were held to a higher degree of accountability, which is a spiritual principle that is throughout Scripture. To whom much is given, much is expected. Well, what was different about Penuel than the men of Succoth? We don't understand. Well, we go back to the very first times that these words show up in Scripture, and that's almost always what you need to do when you have these weird questions. The first time these names and these words show up in Scripture, oftentimes will set the precedent for what they mean. And Penuel is where Jacob met God face to face. And that's what Penuel means. We've met face to face. We've had a face-to-face encounter with the living God. Succoth is where Jacob went after Esau spared his life. Okay, so he had this shelter that was provided because his brother had mercy on him. This was after he had cheated his brother out of his birthright, and he married Leah and Rachel, and he's coming back. One time, on the way back, he meets God face to face, and then he meets Esau face to face, and he's scared. He's afraid. Like, Esau's going to kill me, but Esau doesn't. And Esau says, "No, you're my brother. I'm over it. I was young. I'm fine. I'm wealthy. I don't. It'll be fine." And so Esau spares his life. And one is seeing God in person, and the other is sort of just experiencing the grace and the mercy of God. And there are people who have had such intimate, close experiences with God that he holds them to a higher degree of responsibility. Yes. Jacob met God face to face, and these men who are held to a higher degree of accountability in Penuel than the men of Succoth, and I think it's just what it represents there. And you're like, well, you mean God killed all these men just to make a point? And sadly, yeah, I do think that. They were rotten scoundrels anyway. But Paul says that all the things that happened to Israel happened to teach us. And Jesus himself said in, Luke 12. Let's look that up. Luke 12:35. And this is one of those hard lessons, but I think it's borne out in Scripture. Moses met with God face to face, right? And Moses was told the second time, just speak to the rock.
Yeah.
But he got mad and he struck the rock. And because of that, God held him accountable to his disobedience. And he was not allowed to go into the promised land because of that. And Moses begged and begged and begged.
I know, and I
God
always
said
felt
no.
bad for Moses.
What was that?
I thought that was really a little harsh.
Pardon?
Luke 12, what?
Luke 12. We'll start in verse 35.
Oh, 35.
But it's that's the thing. A lot of people have that same notion. Well, God, you're kind of, Moses was like your best friend. That's the point. It's one thing if the stranger who barely knows me does something to hurt me. But if my best friend does it, the wound is deeper, the offense is deeper, and the divide is greater. And so it's like, it's one thing to see somebody struggling in poverty and that's all they've ever known. But when you see somebody who really understands finance, and knows better and has the wits and the capability of doing it, and yet they're just not, you're like, what are you doing? You know better than this. And it's that whole know better thing. It's the know better part. When, like older siblings who get mad because the younger sibling gets away with something. Like, yeah, but you're older and you know better. They'll learn, they'll get taught, and they'll be held to that degree at some point as well. And I think that's the principle here in verse 12:35, or chapter 12, verse 35 of the Gospel of Luke. Stay dressed for action, which again, they were supposed to be helping the men of war, right? Keep your lamps burning and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at table, and he will come and serve them. Can you imagine what it would have been like for the men of Succoth or the men of Penuel if they had helped Gideon? Afterward, he would have come with and shared the spoils with them and said, thank you so much for your help. But instead, they're just desserts. In verse 38, if he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. But know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Verse 41. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom his master will set over his household, to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if your servant says to himself, my master is delaying in coming, and begins to beat the male and the female servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he does not know, and he will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
In verse 47, and that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. See the difference? There's one gets killed and the other one gets a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. And so you see this principle that Jesus is even confirming. When you know better and you're like, if you're a commander in the army and you disobey, the penalty is worse. If you were aware, but maybe not in the inner circle, it's not as bad. If you're just like an enlisted man, you're gonna get in trouble, but not as much trouble.
So if we have bad things that happen to us, could that be because we've been disobedient?
Well, yeah, that's kind of subjective. I mean, everything could be, and I think it depends on who you are and what is the bad thing that's happening to you. I guess what I'm saying is sometimes bad things happen because bad things happen, and we're in a broken, messed up world. And then other times bad things happen because we've made dumb choices, and it's just natural consequences. But I think there are times when God can allow something severe to happen in your life, like Midian coming to persecute Israel. Why? Because they knew better. They were held to a higher degree of accountability than all of the other nations. God wouldn't get upset with the men of the East worshiping Baal. He's not like livid with them, but he was livid with Israel for doing it, because they were the ones that were provided manna in the wilderness. They were the ones that saw the hand of the Lord deliver them from Egypt. They were the ones that have seen his goodness and tasted of his goodness, and they're out there eating rotten stuff. And so he's mad at them, so to speak. And he holds them to a higher degree. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. Sometimes if something bad happens to you, it is God trying to get your attention, and he's holding you accountable for disobedience or whatever. But a lot of times just something bad happens to you because it's bad. It's a bad world, and God hurts with you, and it's not his direct thing. And the hard part is how are we supposed to know what's God and what's not God? Well, the only way to know that is to talk to God about it. Get my attention. There's an old joke that these three guys wake up in hell, and the one guy says, "Well, I guess I never really was saved. I guess I never really knew God, and it's just bad." And the other guy says, "Well, I know I was saved, but I must have lost it at some point." And then the third guy says, "God must be trying to teach me something." And it's like those three different relationships with God that people can have. And so when bad things happen, oh, God's abandoned me and he's mad at me, or I must have done something, or God's trying to teach me. And I think that third one is a little bit wiser. That everything God does for you, even if it's punishment, is because he loves you.
I think it probably has something to do with the lack of faith. If you have the faith that whatever God gives you, you can handle it with him, but you can't handle it by yourself.
Right. And we've seen this in the story of Gideon. You know, he's in the beginning, he has a visit from an angel. And he still needs, okay, I'm going to put this fleece out, you know. Oh,
Yeah.
and no, I'm going to do it one more time.
Yeah.
You know. And I mean, if that's not, I mean, he met the angel of the Lord. If that's not meeting God face to face, you know, yet God indulges him, right? And he's like, fine, I'll do it for you. I'm trying to build your faith here, trying to help you along. And here, this thing, if Gideon, after experiencing all of this, and we'll see, Gideon's not one who finishes well, which is sad about most of these judges. They start off real good, but they don't finish well. And we see how Gideon himself doesn't finish well. And then things go bad for him, horribly bad for he and his family, because he doesn't finish well. And I think that's because, again, Gideon knew better, you know. And if we take the whole story in scope, you know, we've been talking about how this is how we overcome the enemy, how we overcome, you know, spiritually in warfare. And in this moment, you think of how many times do we give place to the enemy in our lives? How many times do we just submit to darkness and do whatever darkness wants us to do? Instead of taking the narrow path, we take the wide path, and we know better. You know, how many times have been caught in the middle of doing something, and then you're having this internal conversation, I shouldn't be doing this, but you do it anyway. And so this is a common thing. But what God is saying is, the more you know me, the higher accountability I'm going to hold you to. You can't see God face to face and then still act like you've never met God. And there's a principle there that we need to be aware of, you know, especially since, you know, we're of the notion that I want to know God more. I want to know God more. I want to grow in my relationship with Him and my intimacy with Him, but understanding that with that comes the cost. You know, that, well, to know God intimately, to be God's best friend, means that you actually have to be God's best friend. You can't be His acquaintance anymore. You're not going to get away with saying, well, I didn't know. You know, I mean, how many times I've had that same conversation with my own kids, you know, when they were little and they said, I didn't know. That's different. But, you know, if Isaac comes home, you know, with another wrecked car or something like that, and he says, well, I didn't know. He's had a few.
Yeah.
He says, I didn't know. That's not going to fly with me. You know? And it's just that sort of, that principle of you should have known better. You know? And there comes a point in our walks with God when we do know better. We know how we're supposed to live, and yet we still choose to live different ways. And we ask, you know, why? And, you know, Paul gives us some grace in the New Testament. He says, here's the reason why there's a war in your members. You know, you have that old flesh that is fighting the new creation in you, and there's a war there. But we fight. He says, run the race with endurance. Don't give up. Continue the good fight, and then He will complete the good work that He started in you. And it's important for us to not give up. Questions? Got a little bit more to go. What?
Where's the donuts?
Huh?
Where's the donuts? I'm gonna put it.
The donuts are all gone, so you need to go back over and be quiet. How's that?
No. I need donuts.
No, you don't. We'll go home and eat lunch when we're done.
I only have these raisins.
All right. Eat those then. Thank you.
Oh, so much more.
All right.
That's it.
Judges chapter 8, verses 18 through 21. Then he said, and here's where we see remember in the very beginning we talked about that principle of the older generation, the younger generation respecting each other, and the middle generation, it pays it forward as well. But he says to Zebah and Zalmunna, where are the men whom you killed at Tabor? They answered, as you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king. In other words, they're saying, these guys look just like you. And he said, they were my brothers, the son of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you. So they had killed Gideon's brothers. And Gideon was basically saying, if you hadn't killed them, I might have let you live, but you killed them, and so you're going to be killed. And so he said to Jether, his firstborn, rise and kill them. All right, now, remember, Gideon had God nurse him along in this process and be very patient with him, right? And then here in this moment, Gideon expects Jether to suddenly be where Gideon is. And that's not fair. I mean, it simply isn't fair. And who is it that calls Gideon out for this? It says, the young man did not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Then Zebah and Zalmunna, the enemy, says, do it yourself. Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength. And again, I think that's just a reconfirmation of the whole principle. You are what you are. Don't expect other people to be where you're at. You know, and we fall into that trap a lot of times. You know, I've had this great experience with God, and I've learned this about God, and somebody else doesn't understand that yet. And I'm like, how can you not know that? You know, how can you not be where I'm at? And it's because they haven't been taken there yet. And you know, it's difficult to be a teacher and do that. I don't even understand how middle school teachers do it. I just don't get it, because they must feel like they talk all day and no one listens to them. But maybe 2 or 3 out of the whole classroom, because you sometimes feel like I'm talking to people who are not paying attention at all. And then 6 months down the road, one of them will say something to you. Like, you remember when you said this? I'm like, how do you remember that? You know, they are picking stuff up eventually, but you can get exasperated with them as if they're not watching.
No,
All right.
Coach.
So the main point being, you be who you are in God, and don't expect others to be
with you because
all the time.
all the journeys
Be
are
patient
different.
with them as you're teaching them. You know, and God will bring us all to that place where He needs us to be. Any other thoughts or comments?
No.
Okay. All right.
I just need to get out of this. I'm so hot.
So I'm on the wrong.